Hello, and welcome to the MasterVoices podcast, where we invite a diverse range of masterful voices to explore subjects ranging from music and language to history and culture. This pod is a project of the New York City nonprofit MasterVoices, formerly known as the Collegiate Chorale, which then, as now, is dedicated to the unique power of the human voice to connect, unite, and inspire. In the next 3 episodes, linguist, New York Times writer, and Gershwin enthusiast John McWhorter delves into the world of the Gershwin and Kaufman musical, Strike Up the Band. You'll hear from theater historian Lawrence Maslan, New Yorker cartoonist and editor Bob Mankoff, Maestro John Mauceri, and MasterVoices' own maestro and artistic director Ted Sperling, as they unpack the many unique facets of the wholly unique Strike Up the Band. And now, without further ado, sit back and enjoy the MasterVoices podcast.
Hello, everybody. I am John McWhorter. I teach linguistics at Columbia, and I write for the New York Times. And I have the honor of hosting this podcast about the magnificent 1927/1930 musical, Strike Up the Band, with my guest, not to mention good friend, Maestro John Mauceri, who had the privilege about 3 decades ago of conducting a recording, a reconstruction of the musical, right down to full orchestrations and period-style performance. And Strike Up the Band flopped in Philadelphia in 1927, and then was a success in New York in 1930. And so there are 2 editions, but it was, as you probably know, one of a string of dandy musicals that George and Ira Gershwin put together in this era. It was a 20s concoction. The original book was by George S. Kaufman, and then the 1930 book was a revision or kind of a revisal of that by Maury Riskin. And John, who I have here, can tell us about the music. We've talked about the history in one podcast. We've talked about satire in general, of which this musical was an example, in another. And now we can talk about the score. John, what do you remember about conducting these 2 editions of this magnificent musical?
Well, talking about the music is a little bit of a challenge, only because George and Ira wrote together all the time. Mm-hmm. So taking the music out of this, I'm taking everything else out of it and talking about the music is a little bit unfair, because Lenore Gershwin said to me that she would go to bed at night, and her husband and her brother-in-law would be downstairs with the card table next to the piano, and they'd be up until all hours of the night writing songs. So really, the lyrics and the music are kind of forged together. It's not iron, it's steel. It's that. So you kind of have to look at this achievement of these brothers, and I've always been astounded at the love of these 2 brothers, and I've always thought, what a great 2-character play, or what a great thing to, love stories. We never tell that kind of love story, right?
No.
Of siblings, these 2 guys who loved each other, who would do anything for each other. And then when George died, so tragically and surprisingly, Ira had to pull himself together because he lived a normal lifespan. Mm-hmm. And so, how does he cope with that? He doesn't travel. Mm-hmm. He waits a long time and then works with Kurt Weill and other things,
But he was never really the same. Yeah.
No, of course not, because he lost half of his mind and body and creativity. They were one thing. Exactly. So when we talk about Strike Up the Band, the first thing that comes to mind is the fecundity of inspiration. I mean, every number is brilliant. There isn't a dud in that score, in either score. And I believe, well, I understand that what we're going to see at Carnegie Hall and here is fundamentally 1927. The choice was made to build it on the 27 script and the 27 score. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. As you said, it was a flop, but yes, and what do we mean by flop anymore? Because we kind of think flop means it didn't make its money. So yes, so Porgy and Bess is a flop. Right.
Right.
And then we have to look at the larger picture as we get so much further away from that period. The reviews for the 1927 Strike Up the Band were really wonderful. They were astounded at this. The audience didn't want to come. That's all that happened. It's the closing when the audience won't come, as Irving writes.
There's no business like show business. That's right. Yeah.
There's no business like it. And so what makes this so exciting for the audience to experience, because George S. Kaufman is coming off of Coconuts for the Marx Brothers. And so I think when people see it and hear it, they're going to see characters that are very familiar to them, even if they don't know the show, because there's the Margaret Dumont character. There's
exactly.
Right? There's the Groucho character. There's even a Zeppo character. So you can just see that they could have, I'm not the first to point this out, but the Marx Brothers could have made quite a movie of, as opposed to, Duck Soup, which is an anti-war,
or if Strike Up the Band had run longer, the way shows run now, they could have kept audiences coming by having Margaret Dumont and a couple of the Marx Brothers actually in the show.
So now we're talking about a show that owes a lot to Gilbert and Sullivan, and I think that that's also something that we can talk about when we talk about the music, right? And about the relationship of America and Broadway to Gilbert and Sullivan. Whereas George Gershwin really hated the European operetta. So he really had no respect for Zygmunt Romberg, and for, he once said that Zygmunt Romberg writes shows where the audience is whistling the tunes when they walk into the theater, meaning that he's stolen all of them, as opposed to people whistling the tunes when they go out of the theater. But the love for Gilbert and Sullivan is a very American thing and a very Broadway thing. One of the reasons why Gilbert and Sullivan was produced so many times, I mean, the statistics of Gilbert and Sullivan on Broadway are pretty awesome, was that at the time of Gilbert and Sullivan, there was no copyright deal, and so it was public domain. So how many Mikados, how many HMS Pinafores, how many Pirates of Penzances were there on Broadway? So unlike the parody of politics in the words, there's no parody of Gilbert and Sullivan. The Gilbert and Sullivan, the American Gilbert and Sullivan of George and Ira Gershwin, is a love letter to them. I mean, there's no sense that this is stupid when the chorus answers. This is just the way you tell a story. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's not in quotation marks.
No, that's right. So Fletcher's American Cheese Choral Society is very funny. It's as funny as We Are Gentlemen from Japan or opening choruses of any Gilbert and Sullivan.
John, do you feel as I do that it's actually better than Gilbert and Sullivan because the music is rather richer than what Sullivan often wrote? I feel like for me, Gilbert and Sullivan doesn't work until it's Strike Up the Band and of the I Sing, because I'm just waiting for more chords.
Oh, yeah, no, I kind of love what I think they in their own way were a little bit like the Gershwins, because I think any more complexity, there's plenty of tunes that we love. I mean, Titwillow or Wandering Minstrel Eye or, I'm Called Little Buttercup. This is just part of the canon of popular songs. And I think the concept that they developed of a chorus responding as my favorite one being the Japanese equivalent of here, which is one of the funniest things from the Mikado, the Japanese equivalent of here. So I think what makes the Gershwin part of this so interesting is that, of course, they're using American musical form in the sense of the rhythms and stuff. But I wonder if you said to the average person, what does George Gershwin sound like? They will go to Rhapsody in Blue. They will go to a certain aspect of Gershwin without thinking about the large
blue notes and exactly.
Yeah, and black inspired white guy writing having studied with the stride pianists and those people.
And there's only some of that in Strike Up the Band in either score. Yeah.
Very little, actually, right? And it's not appropriate. I mean, if Gershwin lived longer and wrote the Dybbuk, it wouldn't sound anything like Porgy and Bess.
No.
And he was writing Porgy and Bess with that sound to replicate what he imagined Catfish Row and a black community in South Carolina would be appropriate to what.
Right. I'm thinking about Yankee Doodle Rhythm, for example, or I was thinking of, say, Hanging Around with You.
You may tell me you're a saint, but listen to my complaint. What's the use of hanging around with you, hanging around with you, hanging around with you, dearie?
Those have that kind of blues snap that's kind of 20s, but those are just
yeah, I get that. I mean, the syncopation da 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 diddle da 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 dum diddle da da dum da da da. Yeah, that taking a little element and then repeating it against the basic pulse is, yes, that gives it its kind of pep, as George would say, the word pep. I love the fact that he liked the word PEP, which we never use anymore. But there's lots of pep in this score. I do think that one of the reasons why this is so important, I think, for people to hear right now, it's a little bit like, it astounds me that no one's doing The Cradle Will Rock right now, because these are really important musicals that talk about
political statements from the left.
Political statements. Yeah. And you and I, as you know, the people listening to this won't know this, but we're writing a book together on the Broadway musical and about the whole civil rights movement and the Broadway musical. And that has a lot to do with assimilation as well as activism. Now, when you sing it, when you tell that story and you sing it, you can get away with a lot. You can get away with a lot. And what is so wonderful about Strike Up the Band is that it never points its finger at the audience. We're all in on the joke. It assumes the audience is against the war. It assumes that the audience, thinks that a 50% tariff on Swiss cheese, it's a really good thing if you run an American cheese factory, right? Well, right now we have a situation where Donald Trump wants to be the president of tariffs. He says, and sometimes 10%, sometimes it's 100%, and it's 200%, and so it absolutely is of its own moment. And in fact, in one discussion, they're talking about banning books that have anything positive to say about Switzerland, because we're obviously going to have a war with Switzerland. The Swiss want the war in their country because they've got a better tourist industry, right? So all the idea of that, it is so funny. So at one point, the suggestion is that William Tell can no longer be a book that anyone can read because it's pro-Swiss, and that Swiss Family Robinson should become something called, I think, the American Family Robinson, which does a Freedom Prize, right?
Exactly.
Right. So I think the wackiness of Kaufman is going to be wonderful. And I think also Buying the Presidency. I rarely quote Fidel Castro, but I do quote him here when he said, "America has the best government that money can buy."
Oh, and what's the line in the title song in the verse about not knowing what the war was for the last time? There's a cute line.
It's really great.
We fought in 1917, rum-ta-da-dum-tum-tum, and drove the tyrant from the scene, rum-ta-da-dum-tum-tum. We're in a bigger, better war for your patriotic pastime. We don't know what we're fighting for, but we didn't know the last time. So
we fought in 1917, rum-ta-da-tum-tum-tum, and drove the tyrant from the scene, rum-ta-da-tum-tum-tum. We're in a bigger, better war for your patriotic pastime. We don't know what we're fighting for, but we didn't know the last time.
I love that. And that's a musical in 1927. This is not the sort of thing that was typical back then of musicals.
Well, not only was it not atypical, but the audience didn't want it. Mostly, I think they ignored that part, because when the drums roll out and the Strike Up the Band, that's the tune. But when, I remember when I first conducted this, I said, "Oh my God, I didn't realize that was part of the lyric."
Right.
It's an anti-war song. It's making fun of patriotism as an excuse for waging wars.
Exactly.
So, anyway, we wanted to talk about the music. The thing that Ted Sperling is doing is that the score will be built around the 27 version, and he's made a couple of 1930s editions, which I think is really good. You know, the 30s version is a very different show, Maury Riskin, and there's a dream sequence, you know, somebody falls asleep, and that becomes a kind of a go-to. We can solve everything by having somebody either hit on the head, whether that's Dorothy Gale in The Wizard of Oz, you know, so the of the MGM version of The Wizard of Oz is her kind of dream sequence, right? And Oz doesn't exist, which is
so it pulls the punch, so to speak.
Yeah. So Du Barry was a lady, right?
Exactly.
So, you know, you just go through that, you know, and then you know it comes to a different version when Laurie, you know, takes a sniff of the laudanum and has her dream sequence at the end of Act One of Oklahoma in 1943. But my favorite, I'm so glad, first of all, that I've Got a Crush on You is added to the score from 1930, but which has just got that again, that da 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 da. I mean, that
Gershwin pounding on tin, right?
Absolutely, yeah, Gershwin pounding on tin. But the other one is If I Became the President. Now, this is a song again about buying the presidency, and I think when you consider what's going on right now, with, you know, Elon Musk and whatever money, the money that is going in to telling us what we should think about when we vote for president, which is, you know, a really sad situation. I mean, I'm not here to fault Elon Musk. I mean, he's the richest man in the world. He's got his opinion. He wants his opinion. You know, he wants the public to support his opinion. So he's spending all this money. So there's a moment in the dialogue from 1930, which is that, you know, where this idea that the Margaret Dumont character says, you know, what would happen if you became president, I would be the president's wife, and he says, do you think I'd be any good at it, being president? She says, what's that got to do with it?
Right. Yeah.
So my favorite of all the lyrics of Ira Gershwin, you know, was sitting there next to George at the piano, sitting there. You know, I always picture this ever since I met Lenore Gershwin and I got to play George's piano, of this card table, right, just to the right of the high notes. And I'm there smoking a cigar, and George, whatever it is, into the night. So this is the where I come down as the best of these lyrics. If I became the president and I were the president's wife, you'd flood the Senate with your oratory. I'd make each politician prohibit prohibition. 100 billion drinkers would be free. I'd grow. This is the place. I'd grow a beard, I'm thinking. You'd be as great as Lincoln, and Mr. Hearst would surely print your life. But I'd never go so far afield as Tyler, Polk, or Garfield if I became the president and I were the president's wife.
I'd grow a beard, I'm thinking.
You'd be as great as Lincoln, and Mr. Hearst would surely print your life.
But I'd never go so far afield as Tyler, Polk, or Garfield if I became the president.
And I were the president's wife.
I've always loved this song. Yeah.
It's such a good song. So that's going to be part of the text that people will hear. The one that I found from 27, which was the most surprising and moving, it wasn't The Man I Love, and it wasn't some of the other songs. It's a song called Homeward Bound. Homeward Bound, sung by a tenor who really has no other function in the show. Sweet boy who is coming home, hopes to find, you know, the love of his life. And George writes that homeward bound, the home comes before the beat. Each gesture is before the beat.
Homeward bound on the way. Homeward bound, home to stay.
I found it to be such a moving song. And that's part of the key of George Gershwin. He can turn from making you laugh with the music or the relationship with his brother's words, but he can also break your heart.
It's funny. Homeward Bound took me a few listens. I remember when I first listened to the album, I found it dull at first, and then I realized, no, you have to listen more closely to get the genius of that one. And here
Oh,
it is in
I
this,
love it.
yeah, it's
Complete.
beautiful.
Yeah. So the show is about a lot of things that have a lot to do with the world we live in, and um, I think we're in for, I mean, a real treat to hear it. Now, again, what will we hear? What will the orchestra be playing? Now, Tommy Krasker, whose name has not yet been mentioned here, is the actual genius
I was
behind
going to ask you, yeah,
all of the things we're talking about.
how was this thing brought to life from what had become just basically some yellowed pages that were moldering?
Tommy is one of the great heroes for all of us who care about American musical theater, and he knows more than anybody. He's done more. He understands. In 1983, when I was a co-producer of On Your Toes, that was the first time that a show from that period, from 1936, was produced on Broadway without new orchestrations, without new dance arrangements, because up until that point, every show that got revived or revised would have, would get new orchestrations and dance
Like
routines.
No No Nanette, where it's,
Well,
wonderful, but practically a different show than the original in
that's right.
1971.
That's right. You listen to, well, every show. I mean, even Boys from Syracuse, well, that ran for a long time, but again, it was reorchestrated. So the idea that I had, and this I can take credit for, this part I can take credit for, but the rest of it is absolutely Tommy, was I was working for Roger Stevens at the Kennedy Center as his advisor for music theater. And how did I get that job? Because I had lunch with him and I said, Mr. Stevens, there is this huge corpus of American music that is written for a small orchestra of about 20 or so, 24, and no one can play it, whether it's Anything Goes or Showboat or Girl Crazy. And I said, listen, and I said, and he, of course, being a Broadway producer, thought this was like the most astounding thing he'd heard forever. And by the end of the day, I was hired as his music advisor. And the Kennedy Center has a small theater called the Terrace Theater, which seats 500. And we thought we were going to start in that theater, but then the finances didn't work. I mean, really, Broadway needs a bigger theater than 500.
Terrace, Terris, Norma Terrace of
No,
Showboat
Terrace
fame.
as in the top of the, I
Oh, a
actually
terrace.
theater.
Oh,
It's a terrace.
okay. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, not Norma Terrace's theater.
I really thought it was her.
It's a pink little theater designed by Philip Johnson. And actually, I'm one of the few people who actually conducted a Barber Seville in that little theater, 500, which is the size of the theater where it had its world premiere in Rome, 500-seat theater. So you can imagine what Figaro and what those voices were like and the impact. So anyway, the bottom line was that I reached out, in fact, to Ira Gershwin to see if he would give me permission to do Girl Crazy. He wrote back and said, you can do the songs, but you can't do the book. Because I think he really didn't, he was afraid he would be the book would be exposed.
Because the book is silly, or because the book has a
I don't know.
goofy Jewish caricature? Or...
Oh, well, yeah, slick.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, there's the,
Goldfarb, that's I'm.
Goldfarb, that's I'm.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that, it's hard to know, but the bottom line was that Ethel Merman and Ginger Rogers were both, I'd asked them both to reprise their roles from 1930, right?
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, and Ethel was all ready. I mean, she was ready to wear her original costume. She was ready to go. Ginger, on the other hand, wanted her name above Ethel's because she was a movie star, which I think is probably Ginger's way of saying no, but making a demand. And Ethel said, I bet she wants her name above mine, right? So I had to say to Ginger Rogers, I'm sorry, Miss Rogers, your name was not above the title or above Miss Merman's in 1930. She was a teenager, right? No one knew who Ginger Rogers was. And she survived being fired because George thought she couldn't sing. And I said, are you kidding? She's so beautiful. All those college boys are going to adore her. So history was made. And in fact, the first time that Fred Astaire had anything to do with Ginger Rogers was he came in at rehearsals and staged one of the numbers, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I was doing Girl Crazy with a published score because that, unlike Strike Up the Band, had a published score with parts. There were mistakes in it, but I was able to do it with the Boston Pops. And I had a recording of it, which I brought to Lenore Gershwin. In addition, I made a version of Lady in the Dark, which we did with Scottish opera at the Edinburgh Festival. So once she heard them, that's part of how she got the idea that she would underwrite recordings of all the shows that her husband wrote the lyrics to. And that's where this all started. Tommy Krasker was one of my students at Yale. He's the kind of student, and you know, because you teach, there's always a student there who raises his or her hand and says, no, that was 1927, or no, that was Opus 15. I go, thank you.
I know that guy.
You know that person, right?
Sometimes I was that guy. Yeah.
Yeah. And so Tommy then did a Scholar of the House project with me to restore Regina. And he's just like
Lichtenstein's opera, right?
Yeah, and then he was a producer of a lot of my records at the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra. And there's no greater joy than when your children are the ones who then become the ones who are your boss, as it were. That they everything you've given, whatever that might be, or inspired, comes back at you 125%. So Tommy understood that if we were going to record any of these shows, we would do our damnedest to try to replicate what it sounded like, right? And of course, this is really hard because most people don't understand that when a show is a mess, right? Writing a show is a mess. They said, making laws and sausage should never be seen, right? That Bismarck comment, but also added to that, creating a Broadway musical, because songs come in, they go out, you got an orchestrator. And of course, at those times, orchestrators' names were not even being given credit. They were just workers, right? I remember Hans Spialek, the great Hans, who orchestrated so much of later of Gershwin, but also of Cole Porter. And he was and Rodgers and Hart. Said to me, he said, Johnny, the first time I got credit, I was listed between the asparagus and the shoes.
John Mauceri folks actually knew Hans Spialek, who created a lot of what we think of as the Broadway sound, I should mention.
Absolutely. It's a direct line from Gustav Mahler, where he sang as a boy soprano, but that's another story for another podcast. Anyway, so we demonstrated in 1983 where Hans's orchestrations were restored on Broadway, with the show that won Tonys and all that thing, and what got produced on the West End, that if you do a legitimate restoration of the sound of Broadway from 1936, it adds a kind of verisimilitude, a kind of this is what it is. You don't wink and nod at the audience. You actually play the show honestly and truly. And as George Abbott, who directed it, On Your Toes in 1983, and he was 96 years old at the time, his point was the situation may be unnatural, but the response and the acting is totally natural. That's where the humor is. You don't comment on the situation you're in. Play it for real, and the audience finds that to be hysterically funny. So by demonstrating that using Hans's orchestrations and dance arrangements, so that meant that Donald Sadler had to choreograph two pre-existing dance arrangements.
Right.
He had to look at it like he's doing the ballet from Aida. No one says, "Oh, throw out that ballet."
Right.
We need a new ballet, right?
Right.
So with that respect, we demonstrated this was possible. So in a funny way, the series of Gershwin recordings, that Roxbury Music, for which, in fact, Tommy was really in charge artistically, was to restore the sound. Now, this becomes really hard when you get into the 20s, right? Because there's no published score. You find one song maybe has an orchestration. So he was using his amazing imagination to create a verisimilitude, like what would this have sounded like? Reading the reviews, descriptions of stuff, things from programs or a stage manager's script. So we managed with Girl Crazy, that was a kind of an easy one. That was the first one we did. And again, Tommy came up with the idea of Lorna Luft singing the Ethel Merman role. So there you have Judy Garland's daughter singing rhythm, right? And by the way,
John, I don't know if this is going to make it in, but I was under the impression for that recording, folks, this will not go on too long, don't worry. Lorna Luft was a last minute because it was kind of, she had to have the keys changed, etc. Wasn't it that somebody else was originally going to do it and she was brought in? No?
Okay. I'll answer that question to you. Ethel Merman's money note was a C. She could bounce up to a C. Judy Garland's money note was a B flat. which is a whole tone lower, right?
Mm-hmm.
As Lorna said, Mama always said that her money note was B flat. So I
Mm-hmm.
Got Rhythm is in C in 1930 for Ethel. And
Mm-hmm.
what Ethel would say, and I would just belt out that high C. And of course, for those of us who are opera people, that's no high C. That's
No.
lower than a high C.
Right.
But
Yeah.
for a belter, that's a high note.
Yeah, that's the Merman note.
So when we recorded I Got Rhythm, we made that compromise that it was in B flat. So she belts out a high B flat. But there's some things about what that Lorna does there, where there's this a moment where she sometimes sounds like Carl, and you go, holy mackerel, this is really, this is history. So back to the story. Strike of the Band was far more complicated because there are two scores. And the Gershwins threw out so much of what they wrote in 27 for 1930. So we were able to record complete both scores. And Tommy brought in the greatest orchestrators, the ones who had the imagination and the experience to bring back the 20s sound. And sometimes you had to imagine what the number would be like, and this is where, Tommy, I have such admiration for what he's done and the legacy that he's left behind us. And that is, in fact, what Ted Sperling will be conducting. And so this is, and the people who orchestrated for him, most of them now have passed away. So this becomes a treasured moment in the restoration of the Broadway musical.
Amazing. What would you say, John, is your favorite thing in Strike Up the Band? Your favorite number?
Oh, my favorite number. That, I have to, it's very hard to answer that question because I see these scores as totalities.
Mm-hmm.
You know what, as George moves into the 30s, you start to get the sense that he's not just writing songs, but he's writing a total score. Some people like Irving Berlin or Cole Porter were really songwriters, but George Gershwin's aspiration was to be a composer, not a songwriter. Richard Rodgers said to me once that the reason he went into songwriting was because of what he called him, Jerry Kern could do in a song. He found it so inspirational that that's what he wanted to emulate. Then Rodgers moved further toward operatic, larger structures, but never really went there. He got close to that ish in Carousel, but really he was a songwriter, and he wrote scores as a series of songs. Now, when you get to a Cole Porter show, the people plunk in friendship in the middle of anything.
It's all about songs,
and it doesn't seemingly matter.
No.
So by the time you get to Kiss Me Kate, Cole Porter's writing a score.
Right. He snaps into it quickly.
You can't put something in Can from another show.
No.
Stockings, again, it's silk stockings. So Gershwin in 27 is writing a score, and Forever goes in and out.
Right.
So it's impossible to say what do I like the most. There's no question that Strike Up the Band is one of the most extraordinary songs because the beginning of it in the minor is very kind of Jewishy sounding.
So
right?
Wonderful in that way. Yeah. Exactly. You would never know what's coming from that verse.
You wouldn't.
Exactly.
Right? And you're brought into this thing, and then you get this amazing melody and harmony. And so you'd have to go there. But The Man I Love, again, that is such an extraordinary song. They're just one after another. The famous ones and the ones who are not famous, they're all of the same quality. So I think the audience is going to have a really extraordinary time and to explore Gershwin that they don't know because they still think it's that opening clarinet glissando that starts Rhapsody in Blue, which actually George didn't write. It was played by the clarinetist. I like that.
Ross Gorman, right?
Let's put that in. And so much of Rhapsody in Blue is a response to the New Haven Railroad, where he forgot he was supposed to write it, and so he wrote it on the train on the way to Boston. So
therefore, the rhythm,
right?
Yeah.
Next,
but the thing about Strike Up the Band also is that you have to listen somewhat closely. It's not work. It's not like sitting through the complete Hamlet or something like that, but there are a lot of words and they're wonderful words. My favorite in terms of wordiness is Unofficial Spokesman, one of the Gilbert and Sullivan moments where just every line is delightful. Everything scans perfectly. It's still genuinely funny. I recommend that one, but it is a magnificent score and it's very much a score. And Gershwin was doing that earlier than most of his peers, as John is saying. It's not just a bunch of dandy little songs. This is a piece of work. It's a whole work, and it's worthy of this kind of evening. John, before we finish, how big is the orchestra for this? Do you remember?
Well, it would be about 24. Again, when people ask that question,
Mm-hmm.
they're looking for a total number, but as you very well know, when the basic organico, as the Italians call it, will be the woodwinds and the brass and percussion.
Mm-hmm.
Usually there's one percussionist. And is there a harp or is there a piano? Are there two
Mm-hmm.
pianos, which was very popular at that time and right into
Mm-hmm.
the 1930s? And usually it's a choice. Is the orchestration based on the operetta model or on
Mm-hmm.
jazz band model, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in Girl Crazy, that was Red Nichols. That
Mm-hmm.
was a jazz band in the pit, even though Robert Russell Bennett orchestrated it. But
Mm-hmm.
you're gonna have you get Gene Krupa on the drums, right?
Right.
That must
Whereas
have
with this one, it's kind of in between, isn't it?
well,
Because
it's
at
more
times it's
operetta.
Romberg and
It's basically more operetta than that because we're not talking about saxophones and and the jazz thing. We're talking about an operetta orchestration in the sense that it is, flute, clarinet, oboe, bassoon, horns, strings, uh,
mm-hmm.
and a harp. Now, I'm not sure whether 27 had the harp in it, but certainly 30 had the harp in it. And again, this will be a choice that will be made at the performance we're going to see. So the answer to the question you asked is how big is the orchestra? It will have to do with whether you double the strings or not. Orchestra pit in Broadway are small. They've never been big. And
It's always an issue, yeah.
there was a big change in 45 when Rogers took out rows of seats for Carousel
Mm.
because he wanted more strings, right?
Mm-hmm.
He could do that. He was a rich man and, he could do that.
By then, right, yeah.
Yeah, and then when it went on tour, they pulled it back down. But there was a bass clarinet part as opposed to a bassoon part, and that threw that one out when it went on tour, just to keep it so that it could make some money and continue the tour. So basically, those shows had 24 in them,
Mm-hmm.
and by the way, importantly, acoustically orchestrated, no microphones, no amplification. They
Mm-hmm.
had to know what to do, what the voice could do. And some of those voices were small. These were
Mm-hmm.
not operatic voices, which is, of course, the difference from really an operetta, because you had people who could really sing. They were trained operatic voices, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Gershwin was not necessarily writing for that kind of voice. So again, what we tried to do, certainly what Tommy did, and when I conducted it, but a lot of that, of course, is mixed, is that we were restoring the natural relationship between the size of a voice and the orchestral accompaniment. And when people hear it, I think one of the things there's a word called figurations. I mean, this is the word that Hans used to use. What is a figuration? Hans had his figurations and Russell Bennett had his figurations. Every time a singer sings, there's going to be a moment where the singer has to breathe, right? Because we breathe, and not like a pipe organ. And so when the singer breathes is when the orchestrator can add information to fill in that breath. And that's called figuration. So again, when they're singing, the orchestra goes down. Maybe it's doubling the voice. That's possible, and sometimes that happened. In the case of The Man I Love, the strings all double the tune. That's the original orchestration on our recording, and I'm sure that you'll hear that in Carnegie Hall. However, when you have these moments where the person stops singing to breathe, that's when the commentary can go in. Now, the other reason why doubling the voice is such an interesting thing is because in the 20s, you tended to sing the rhythms as written. So this is also where it becomes the operetta meeting the jazz world, the dance world changes. I know Hans said to me that when he orchestrated Pal Joey, 1940-41, Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, the tune was doubled in the strings. When it was revived in the 50s, Vivian Siegel said, don't do that anymore. So he took out the doubling so she could, instead of singing, I'm wild again, beguiled again, she could go, I'm wild again.
A little bit of parlando, right?
Well, yeah, and back phrasing, and that all came later during World War II era. But we weren't doing that on Broadway in the 20s.
In 1927,
Well,
right?
because
Exactly.
so much of what we call jazz, which is really ragtime, is motoric singing. It's the only reason why this becomes so peppy is because there is a taka 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 going. So you go, I've got rhythm, it's completely working as this kind of motoric thing under it. So you go, I got rhythm. That's so flaccid and so impossible. It has nothing to do with what George had in mind. Same thing is true of all those ragtime songs. They're based on a single pulse that never changes. And the accents change, which you have to have this something that is immovable for the thing that is moving to make itself known. So again, that's why what Tommy and his orchestrators and our orchestrators did was to insist on that kind of history of performance practice. Not back phrasing. It's not, it's just not. It didn't exist. It might have existed with say Helen Morgan singing He's Just My Bill because she had a pianist. But when there's an orchestra there, no. And by the way, when the orchestra does come in, when she sings it again, it's strings. It's a halo of strings.
I think a great example of this figuration would probably be Hanging Around With You, where when the person isn't singing, the orchestra does nice things. And also, you have to stay with the rhythm. You can't mess around with Hanging Around With You. It's solid power. 20s. Yeah,
exactly. That's its power. And I'm sure that will be a kind of a revelation for the audience, because again, as I said, I think people don't understand the genius. I mean, they know George Gershwin's name, and they know he wrote some hit songs, and they probably know, obviously they know the Rhapsody in Blue, and they know Porgy and Bess, and they know some songs, but the genius is his unbelievable flexibility and his constant desire to learn more. I mean, he wanted to study with he wanted to know more and more and more, whether that was a black musician in Harlem or whether that was Maurice Ravel or whether it was Arnold Schoenberg. He wanted to know more and more. And so the loss is so profound. And I always use this as an example that when he died, the eulogy on national radio was delivered by Arnold Schoenberg.
He grew more in his final 10 years than I think any of his colleagues can be said to have. Porter did some growing, Rogers did some growing, but Gershwin exploded.
He did explode. You can argue that later Kern is the best Kern.
Somewhat, exactly. Yeah, he grew too, but not as quickly as George. He just exploded.
If you think about George's first hit and when he died, everything we know of George Gershwin happened within a 20-year period.
Imagine what would have happened if he had lived longer. Yeah.
Well, you can't. That becomes the sad story of of something that you just don't even know what to do with that thought. Where would he have gone? Because the last scores in Hollywood are so 1930s. I mean, Strike Up the Band is a 20s score. By the time you get to the 30s and you get to Girl Crazy and also the second version of this, things are changing. By the time you get to Shall We Dance with Fred and Ginger, that sound of that last ballet, which I had the honor of recording in the Gershwins in Hollywood,
again, would have been alien to 1927. Exactly.
We're now into a world of curvilinear design, and I mean architecturally, you feel the white walls, as opposed to the dark metropolis world of the city of New York, right? With a rivet. Now you're into something so glorious, so big, so utopian. And he managed to capture that in harmony. So where would he have been in the 40s or the 50s? So the only thing we can say is we can only look at people like Harold Arlen and those who continued on, from that period and who blessedly for us live way on into our time.
Definitely. I think on that note, so to speak, John, we can leave it here. And I hope that you all listening out there in the dark have gotten a sense of what a musical feast Strike Up the Band is and will be on October 29th when performed by MasterVoices under Ted Sperling's supervision.
Thank you for listening to the MasterVoices podcast. To learn more about MasterVoices, visit mastervoices.org. You can discover our rich history, read chorus member spotlights, and buy tickets to upcoming performances. You can go there to support our work by making a tax-deductible donation. Your gift will allow us to continue our mission to spark greater human connections by reimagining what the choral experience can be. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.